Excellent. Welcome everyone to the Seattle 2030 District Education Forum event. This one is, we're really excited about this event. It's going to be focusing on distributed energy resources, or DER, zero net energy, and the Clean Energy Transformation Act, and how utilities are working to achieve goals designated under this new legislative mandate, CETA, as it's formally known. Today's event is put on by Seattle 2030 District, which is a wonderful nonprofit organization based in Seattle, Washington. That's part of the Architecture 2030 Challenge for Planning. So our district goals here in the Seattle 2030 District focus on energy use reduction, water use, and reducing CO2 emissions. I'm really grateful for Seattle 2030 District and its work to bring a number of different experts and stakeholders in the architecture, engineering, and construction industry, as well as really energy experts and utility folks, regulators, power planners, policy experts. So many different wonderful folks coming together to work on these important issues. My name is Jack Newman. I work as Director of Clean Energy Solutions at Säzän Environmental Services, and I also volunteer as Board President at Solar Washington. Today, I'll be moderating the discussion, and I'm very grateful to have three panelists presenting today. Our first presenter will be Eli Lieberman, Manager of Sustainable Energy Programs at Washington State Housing Finance Commission. Eli will be highlighting some important and interesting details on how projects are achieving some of these goals and working towards a more sustainable future in the built environment. We'll also be joined by Alexi Miller, Associate Technical Director at the New Buildings Institute. And Alexi's got a really nice perspective that connects the buildings and optimization of the buildings as they interface with the energy grid. So we'll be tracing, buildings and project examples to how those buildings interface with the grid. We also have Robert Cromwell here today from Seattle City Light. Robert works as Director of Customer Solutions. And a wonderful presenter to talk more about how utilities are shifting to clean energy. So we're really grateful for our panel. And just a reminder, if you don't mind to stay muted during the presentation as we are recording for folks who are not able to attend, and to use the chat to chime in with any questions you may have. So yeah, we're grateful for your attendance and looking forward to a wonderful discussion here. I'm gonna go ahead and make Eli the host. And Eli, I think you're ready to kick things off here with your presentation. And I'll go ahead and turn off my video for a moment. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks, Jack. Yeah, it looks like I'm the host now. So let me see if I can go into presentation mode here. Share screen. There we go. Sorry.
We see your screen.
Oh, beautiful. Love it. Okay. Figured it out. Let's go. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Eli Lieberman. And as Jack was saying, I'm the manager of the Sustainable Energy Program at the Washington State Housing Finance Commission. Just a brief overview for those who might not be familiar with the commission's work. We are a quasi-state agency, so I'm a state government employee, but we're entirely self-funded. So we have a little bit of independence from the normal legislative process, which is kind of allows us to be a bit of a unique agency that we can sort of respond to market conditions a little bit more quickly as we don't use taxpayer dollars. So specifically, we kind of offer financing for affordable housing in a couple different capacities. We issue tax-exempt bonds, mortgage-backed securities. This is for first-time home buyers, the single-family home buyers. We also offer really generous down payment assistance, which are usually sort of second lien, 30-year deferred sort of grants, effectively. And then our primary sort of thing we do is we offer, we're the state agency that allocates low-income housing tax credits. So this is the primary means of funding affordable housing throughout the United States. Every state has a version of the Washington State Housing Finance Commission that is sort of devolved the sort of LIHTC powers by the IRS, and the Washington State Housing Finance Commission is Washington's version. We also offer several revolving loan funds, everything from land acquisition for nonprofits. So if they're able to come across a piece of land that they think they'll be able to build on in the future for affordable housing, but are concerned about the market, they can sort of act quickly to acquire that land. And then on that one, it's basically like a deferred, almost zero interest loan until the project is developed. So that's a really excellent product we offer. We just launched a new product for community land trusts, for construction loans for community land trusts. And then today, specifically, I'm going to talk about one of the loans that I manage, which is the Sustainable Energy Trust, which is a revolving energy loan fund that provides below market rate loans, hopefully to sort of prove out market concepts that then can be taken over by the private market. So one of the first things we were doing in Seattle was we were underwriting off of the proposed energy efficiency improvements from multifamily retrofit. So we were looking what the consultants were saying was going to be, the monthly savings, and we were, basically using that as a source of cash flow to underwrite our loans, which is not historically something that banks are doing. They're doing it a little bit more now. And so we offer term lengths up to 10 years. Our interest rates are quite low at 1% to 5%. They're usually about 2%. We'll lend up to $1 million. And we sort of have three tranches that we operate from. We have single family, multifamily retrofits. The single family is actually new construction. We primarily work with Green Canopy in the city of Seattle. We've helped them bring a bunch of different projects to market and then also put some affordability covenants on some of their projects. And the third tranche that we lend on is clean energy. So this is mostly solar on affordable housing, but we also will do work with farms and nonprofits. So we've done solar also on nonprofits. And for farms, we're actually doing a bunch of biodigesters recently, which has been really cool, including one with Finn River Cidery in Chimicum, which was a great one because that meant I meant to have business trips to Finn River. So drinking was part of the job there. So with Robert here, I wanted to talk about a new partnership that the Sustainable Energy Trust launched with Seattle City Light, actually. So Seattle City Light operates this Green Up program where I believe just sort of ratepayers in Seattle can elect to sort of provide a little bit extra on their bill to sort of obtain more green attributes in the power grid. And then what the Green Up Grant Program does is they purchase renewable energy credits from solar projects in the city. And they have an interesting way of doing this. It's not on a kilowatt hour basis, it's on kilowatts installed. So what we did is we sort of used this model from NREL, and we looked at like, what's the purchase price of these RECs on this per kilowatt basis? What are the sort of terms of the lending that the Sustainable Energy Trust is doing? And how could we bring those in line so we could go to an affordable housing provider or a nonprofit facility and say, between this sort of low interest loan and this renewable energy credit purchase, could we actually get solar to pencil in Seattle from like day one, which almost seems impossible. But we were able to figure out what the numbers were. And Seattle City Light was able to increase the REC purchase price, which was the crux of this. So how it works is the SET provides a low interest loan up front so that the organization doesn't need to worry about their balance sheet to finance this. The loan will fund the construction of it. While construction is going on, the loan's actually not accumulating interest. Once the panels are operational, then Seattle City Light can do that REC purchase. The REC purchase buys down the SET's principal. At that point, the loan begins to amortize with this low interest rate. And from the modeling we've done, the electricity savings at that point should be greater than the payments to the commission. So in theory, an organization doesn't have to use any of their cash, will get the solar installed, and then immediately should start generating some sort of savings. And then once the loan is paid off, then it's just all gravy from there. So we just launched this, and we're working on 2 projects right now in Seattle. The first one is the Brighton Apartments, which is a majority BIPOC senior apartment in Seattle's Rainier Valley. All of their residents are 50% AMI or less, area media income. A bunch of them are actually at 30% AMI. I was talking to Curtis from the Seattle Senior Foundation the other day about this. So that means that we're talking about people on really fixed incomes. So right now, this set loan SCL rec purchase, we're restoring the roof. That's more from the commission than from SCL. But once the roof is fixed up, then they're going to install a 100 kilowatt system. And we'll do this new partnership, which we're really excited about. And then hopefully the utility savings should be realized greater than the payments to the commission. And then those savings can go to enhancing resident services as opposed to going to Seattle City Light. Sorry, Robert, but you helped. So, and then Village Garden Apartments is the other one we're working on. And this is a really cool project, actually. So this is 16 all-electric townhomes in the Central District. 6 of the townhomes are on fee simple lots that'll be sold at market rate. And the profits from that are going to help 10 of the homes will be on a land trust structure. So the land underneath the homes will be owned by Homestead and will be leased to the potential buyers. It's usually like a 99-year lease, and that ensures the permanent affordability. So if those buyers decide to sell, they have to use a formula so that the homes will always stay below market rate considerably. Like I think the 3-bedroom townhomes are going to go on the market for like in the 3s, mid to low 3s in Seattle, which is just amazing. They're all electric, highly energy efficient. And this partnership is going to fund 53 kilowatts between the 10 townhomes, the affordable townhomes. And because of those market rate ones, providing some extra cash flow, and then just the ability of this rec buy down and low interest loan, the cost of the solar won't be added on when these homes are sold to the low income buyers. So effectively, they're going to be able to purchase these very energy efficient townhomes that are generating probably almost enough electricity to cover, they'll almost be net zero, I believe. So that's really awesome. It'll just allow the residents to generate wealth as opposed to utility expenses. So we're really excited about that project. And then the third and last thing I wanted to highlight, just again, talking about aligning CETA and utilities and other government funders like the commission, is that during the LIHTC process, so this is allocating the low-income housing tax credits to build new affordable housing, the commission recently implemented a utility incentive requirement. So before, all of our LIHTC projects were eligible for SCL or PSC utility incentives for, new construction and retrofits. We weren't sure if our developers knew about these. So we did a bunch of stakeholder outreach to the developers and to SCL and to PSC, and we figured out that the uptake rate of these incentives was really low. It was, like, as you can see, about 30% or less. So this just seemed like lost value. So what we did is, after I finished this outreach, I was like, okay, I think we just need to make this a requirement. So we now have a requirement that during the application process, you have to have already reached out sort of in the development phase to contact your utility to discuss like your project, what incentives they offer, can you bring those in line? We don't have a requirement that you have to use the incentives, it's just that you have to contact the utility. And we really just wanted to make the connection so that like every developer in the LIHTC process knows that there's a person out there that's going to be their utility service provider. They can call and they can connect about these sort of incentives. And that's what we wanted our role to be. And now that we've been implementing this, it's gone from, low 30s to 100%. So we're really happy. And as you can see, PSC is working with a bunch of different projects right now. So this was a great win for us on the sort of connecting and aligning all the different programs out there. So that's all I've got for me today. And I will now pass it on to Alexi. And here's my email address if anyone wants to contact me. It's eli.lieberman@wshfc.org. So I am going to stop sharing. And then I'm going to go to participants and going to find Alexi. And then I'm going to make him a host.
Once you make me a host or presenter, oh, here we go. I should be up and running. How's it working?
I can see it, Alexi. Looks good.
Looks great.
Thanks. All right. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm going to follow up a bit on some of the conversation we had last month with probably some of you here. Talk a bit about the confluence of zero net energy buildings or buildings in general and distributed energy resources. So kind of like we were talking about at the very beginning, you know, the connection between buildings and the grid, and what does that mean as the grid changes? What's the role of buildings going to look like? Just a quick note, I'm the Associate Technical Director at New Buildings Institute. We're a nonprofit organization. We've been around 20 some years now, getting toward 25 years, working to advance high performance buildings, move buildings toward zero energy, toward zero carbon and beyond. And we do that through research into innovative building technologies and strategies, through policy development, like model codes, helped write the Washington State Code and in Seattle as well, through design guidance, and I'll mention some of the stuff we're putting out right now, and through broader market transformation pushes. So I get to wear a lot of hats, basically. And one of those hats is I manage our Getting to Zero Buildings database, which tracks all the zero energy buildings across North America, commercial multifamily buildings. And we've found more than a 12-fold increase since we started tracking about a decade ago. We're up to 720 some right now, both verified buildings. We know, we've seen their energy data. They really did get to zero on an annual basis. That is, they produced as much energy through renewables as they consumed over the course of a year. And they're everywhere. They're all over the country. They're in every climate zone. Every building type is represented. So that's really encouraging, right? It is possible to get to zero. They're growing pretty fast from a small number at first, but we're seeing substantial growth, which is really encouraging. And there's a nice green cluster in Seattle, lots of verified buildings in Seattle as well. So that's encouraging. And then the number one thing I want to say is the biggest strategy that these buildings are using to get to zero is taking an efficiency first approach, which is important not just for zero energy building, but for being a good grid citizen and more broadly. So the median EUI, energy use intensity, of these ZE buildings in our database is just above 20, it's about 22, which is less than half of a medium office as of about a 10 years ago vintage. And is about half of most codes right now. So really quite high performance buildings. And sometimes I use zero energy as a filter for high performance buildings. But excuse me, I want to talk a bit about what would happen, say, if lots of buildings got to zero. If we went way beyond 720 and we got to tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of buildings getting to zero energy. What's showing here on the screen is the 5 foundations of zero carbon building policies. You'll notice efficiency is first, and then renewable energy. So those are the 2 basics of a zero energy building as it's been imagined so far. You have an efficient building, you put some renewables, usually solar on the roof, maybe you procure them some other way. If it's a tall building or a very urban context, you can't, or a very high intense like a hospital, maybe you can't put enough solar on that. It's just not feasible. So you procure some other kind of renewables, but one way or another, you drive your consumption down, you balance it with renewables. That's the classic approach. The grid, however, is not an infinite battery. And so treating the grid like an infinite battery is a limited strategy. We can only do it so far. And as the grid incorporates more variable renewables like wind and solar, we're pushing the limits of that in some places and in some times of year. So that's when the next foundation here, the one that's circled in red, grid integration and storage and EV, which are distributed energy resources or DERs. That's when that really comes into play. So that's where I'm going to focus. But I want to show this and pause for just a minute to say these are the 5 foundations of zero carbon building policy. Energy efficiency is core. Renewable energy is a necessary part of the picture. Now we're going to really focus in on grid integration and storage to ensure that buildings can not only help decarbonize themselves, but can be enablers of broader energy system decarbonization. Electrification, so as the grid cleans up, the buildings clean up in parallel, and we're not burning gas in buildings with a nice clean grid we could be using. And then life cycle impacts, embodied carbon, refrigerants, things like that. So I'm going to dive into this grid integration and DERs. One of the other hats I wear at NBI, metaphorically speaking, is I lead the GridOptimal Buildings Initiative, which is all about building grid integration. And we've been working for about 3 years now to create new metrics for building grid integration and to advance outcomes in buildings so that they can help enable that broader energy system decarbonization. So I'll cover a couple things here. The grid is incorporating more variable renewable energy resources, mostly solar and wind. What this means is sometimes of the day, there is more solar or wind on the grid than during other times of the day. Similarly, some times of year, there's more renewable energy content in the mix than in other times of year. So on the left here, we see California. On the right, we see Seattle area. And what I want to point out is California is a solar dominated grid, or rather a solar heavy grid. The bulk of the renewable energy in California comes from solar. So that's what's driving the big variability in carbon emissions factors across time of day. So middle of the day when the sun's shining, the California grid is relatively clean. In the evening, after the sun goes down, but when demand is still pretty high across the system, the grid is pretty dirty. That's when the gas plants kick on. Relatively dirty. In Seattle, there's a lot of hydro, as you probably are well aware. And so the picture is a bit different. There's a lot of hydro flowing through those, a lot of water flowing through those rivers in the spring. From March through maybe July, there's pretty clean generation available. Seattle City Light has its own picture. So this is not the utility specific usage. This is sort of a more broadly regional for this area of the country. It's not specifically Seattle City Light's mix. Theirs is even more hydro heavy and cleaner. But generally, we know we're all connected to the same grid. The same electrons are bouncing around between the wires of one utility and another. So generally, regionally speaking, Seattle's got some relatively clean midday generation, and the dirty hours are happening for the most part overnight, not in the spring and early summer. What this tells us is there's no one size fits all strategy. In California, using more power during daylight hours would probably be good, and trying to reduce your usage during the evening and overnight, especially in the summer, would be good. In Seattle, it's pretty hard to store power from April and use it in November. And so different strategies are called into play. I want to give an example of a building in Seattle. So here is an average building. This is actually the official DOE average. It's the code determining prototypes. ASHRAE 90.1, 2004. So a building compliant with that code. A medium office in Washington. The larger light blue line is the building demand over a day in January, so peak wintertime. You can see January is a relatively high emissions month in Washington. And then on the other part of the chart is the long run marginal carbon. So that's the emissions factor. It's a bit cleaner during the day than it is overnight. And you can see there's sort of an inverse correlation between the building's demand profile and its long run margin and the grid's carbon picture. But they do link up there about 7 in the morning when everything's ramping up. The building's got relatively high demand, right? Morning warm up is spiking, and the grid is still pretty high carbon from its sort of overnight highs. So that would be a good place to focus if we could find a way to reduce that morning warm up spike. That would have sort of an outsized impact in terms of carbon. Now, if we stuck PV on this building, the net building demand goes down dramatically during the day, right? And so we've got, we're certainly trimming our carbon, but it's not making the biggest splash you could possibly imagine overnight. And we still have that morning warm up spike, right? Those two concurrent high demand, high carbon. And so that tells us that PV alone is probably not going to solve this particular picture. And if what we want to do is reduce the carbon in this building on a time of use basis, then we probably have to go farther than just PV. PV is certainly helpful, but it's not the only solution we're going to use. So that is where we either bring in storage, or we start finding ways to use the building systems as a battery. Time of use flexibility, right? Maybe we can do some preheating, or even just enhanced energy efficiency. It is the first place to go to lower that morning warm-up spike. Here's the same prototype. If we put enough PV on to reach net zero energy over the course of a year, this is monthly. We're no longer looking at hours of the day. Now we're looking at months of the year, January through December, and it's all the hours of the year for each month added up, right? So this ends up totaling 8,760 hours. And in each case, it's the net emissions. When we're exporting to the grid, we're figuring out what's the emissions factor on the grid during that export time. When we're importing, we're figuring out what's the emissions factor on that import time. And in this case, the building reaches zero energy through photovoltaics, but it doesn't quite get to zero carbon, because basically many of the times we're exporting, the grid is relatively cleaner than it is when we're importing. So this tells us in this case, if we want to reach zero carbon through on-site renewables, we'd actually have to put on more than 100% zero energy in terms of the amount of PV that would go on. For all electric buildings nationwide, the average is something like 106 or 110%, but it varies pretty widely by building type, by region. You know, there's lots of details, as you might imagine. So it's typical to be a bit over. If you were trying to get to zero carbon, you'd have to export a bit more, because that's what happens when you have lots of solar on the grid. The carbon intensity is a bit lower during those times of high solar, which is when the building might be exporting. So that tells us, you know, first of all, we already knew the grid is not an infinite battery. And then second, zero energy is not quite the same thing as zero carbon. And as the North Star shifts, as the main goal we're trying to get to moves from zero energy to zero carbon, that means we have to think a bit bigger, which is why I mentioned those 5 foundations. Now, I did say we're leading the GridOptimal Buildings Initiative. We've got this design guidance coming out shortly. Should be out here next month with, these are the 4-page fact sheets, sort of 80-20 solutions without having to get a PhD in building grid integration and operations. What are some basic things I can do in an office building or in our region? So we've got a couple drafts of these coming up, and stay tuned for when those come out. Very briefly, just want to mention a couple of concrete strategies, just so I can leave you something that you can sink your teeth into. End uses that align with high net load hours, that is hours on the grid that tend to be high cost and high carbon. So in an office building, those include improvements in the core and shell, the building envelope, plug loads, whether that's energy efficiency or controls to address appliances and plugs. And the reason for that is their schedules are often really well aligned with those high net load hours, and managed EV charging. So the ability to either shift or adjust loads from electric vehicles, which can be big. Some other things to think of are, if you're putting solar on, it's good to point it west so that a bit more of the generation comes in the evening when it's a bit more helpful. Smart inverters that are compliant with IEEE 1547 makes sure that there's some ability for those inverters to sort of play nice with the grid, makes the distribution grid management somewhat easier, or at least we expect it will in the future. And then just the word co-optimization, I think, is important. Say you're putting in a battery, if it's designed for resiliency, it may not reduce carbon. If it's designed purely to reduce cost, it may not reduce carbon or provide resiliency. So keeping in mind what the point of the system is, and trying to include greenhouse gas reductions as well as either cost or resiliency, or perhaps all of them, is pretty important to make sure that gets there. In California, they rolled out a program called the Self-Generation Incentive Program, the SGIP. In the first generation, they basically incentivized behind the meter batteries without a whole lot of attention to control for greenhouse gas reduction. And what they found was they actually increased carbon because of when they were charging and discharging. So they were purely, in most cases, they were dispatched on cost, and they saved people some money on their energy bills. but they drove up the carbon emissions in California in general. So round two, they addressed that, but that's a good lesson learned there, that it may be a solution in theory, but if it's a problem in practice, then we're not doing it right. And I think with that, I'm just going to leave with this message here that zero carbon buildings are possible. Zero energy buildings are not quite the same thing, although they are a big piece of the picture. And building in, either through operations or design, building in flexibility, demand flexibility, and ensuring that we've got the demand nicely aligned with renewables, whether on-site or off-site, is key, especially as we see this big transformation in our energy systems. So here's our website, lots of resources, including next month, we'll have those design guidance pieces up there, and drop me a line if you'd like to either pilot a project for design or operations, or if you have questions about GridOptimal in general. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Alexi. Do you want to return control to Jack? I did not prepare slides for this morning.
Yeah, I'll do that right now. Jack, you're the host.
Thank you, sir.
Video, and I'll be around. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the opportunity to join you this morning. As Jack said, my name is Robert Cromwell, and I'm the Director of Customer Energy Solutions here at Seattle City Light. And in the hopes that I will be again tomorrow, my comments should be taken as my own and not necessarily the position of Seattle City Light or our mayor and city council members. My interest in this discussion is really in hearing from all of you as my customers, and to better understand the needs and how I, as part of a large utility here, can help you meet them. And while Jack was very kind, I am very far from expert in this area and look forward to learning with you. So my personal lens on the work that we're doing right now is energy, equity, and carbon, because I believe that those are going to be the three fundamental drivers of our behavior going forward. On the energy side of the equation, we have to keep the lights on. Reliable service is going to continue to be our North Star in terms of the work that we do as a utility. And I would just note that all of the studies that look region-wide at decarbonization clearly indicate that once the region starts to approach 80% renewable penetration on the electric system, reliability challenges begin to surface in a way that's very challenging to resolve without retaining some of the natural gas generation that we currently have. I also believe that to achieve that decarbonized future for our state and the region, we're going to need to build a lot of transmission. And that means putting 500 kV transmission circuits in the backyards of people that really don't want to see them. The second principle that I believe is going to drive our behavior is equity. And for those who are familiar with the Clean Energy Transformation Act, it is very rightly forcing us to have some very significant internal reckoning around how we center equity in the work that we do. I think that we're going to have a lot of tough conversations, both within our organization, but also with our customers. Rate design is one that Alexi and Eli have sort of touched on it implicitly, but I'll be more direct. Current net metering policies are essentially subsidizing the deployment of photovoltaics at the cost of people of more modest means. And in Seattle, that is disproportionately BIPOC communities. And so I think that as we drive towards the net zero built environment that Alexi just described, it's going to require us to have some conversations around rate design and other fairly esoteric matters, because we really can't have a net zero built environment goal and continue to have a rate design that is premised on selling kilowatt hours. I also want to just acknowledge and recognize that the utility industry does have a bias towards sort of knowing what's good for our customers and providing what we believe people want, as opposed to listening. And so for me, in this role, what I'm really trying to emphasize is the need for our organization to really start to listen deeply to our customers, to better understand their needs and wants, and find ways to help them achieve those goals in a way that doesn't exacerbate existing inequalities and inequities in how we deliver power. I'll also note that our incentive-oriented business model that has served us well for the last 50 odd years, that City Light's been engaged in conservation or energy efficiency work, may not be sufficient to get us to where we need to be from an equity perspective. It's my expectation that as we go forward, we're very likely to need to lean hard on our commercial and industrial customers, like the members of the 2030 district, to achieve our energy efficiency savings, because I expect that we're going to have to go very deeper into the equity space with our residential customers to meet the expectations that the elected leaders of the city have for us. And then on carbon, Alexi described it far better than I can, but I will say that for City Light, we've been greenhouse gas neutral since 2005. And effectively, the only way to wring additional carbon out of our portfolio is to work with BPA, the Bonneville Power Administration, that provides about 1/3 of our energy off the federal Columbia system, so that we can have a power product that is compliant with CETA, and then also to work with and support our colleagues in other utilities across the West, so that we can decrease the carbon intensity of the generation profile of the region, because that comes back to us through the wholesale energy market purchases upon which we all rely. And I'll also note, with that respect, that the wholesale energy markets are going to have to grow and expand if we're going to achieve the goals that have been set for us. And for those who are wary of markets, that may be a very inconvenient truth for many to accept. But I would just note that we are facing a very different set of challenges than we had 20 years ago. For those who were around and lived through the 2000-2001 crisis, as I did. But the energy market we have today is not the one we had 20 years ago. And frankly, it is not the market we're going to need in 5 years. And so that concludes my remarks. I'm happy to answer any questions, but personal preference would be to have a discussion.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you, Alexi and Eli, for your wonderful presentations. I guess I'll just kick it off. I have a quick question because, Robert, you hinted at something that's really important and kind of near and dear to my heart around the clean energy industry in Washington State in particular. It's regarding incentives and kind of a game changer approach to advancing equity in our communities. So folks may be familiar with the Renewable Energy System Incentive Program, and this was a fantastic driver of solar deployment, creating 1,000+ jobs in the solar sector. However, going back to Eli's point about trying to prioritize investments in efficiency and renewables with low-income communities, vulnerable communities, working with affordable housing, and really focusing on AMI as an indicator for who is accessing these benefits. The Renewable Energy System Incentive Program was kind of put under a microscope recently to see who participated in the program. And the results show that the $100+ million invested by the state into this solar production incentive program, on average, went to folks who are 180% above AMI. So we know that what we've been doing with incentives has really just continued to prop up inequities and income inequality in the solar sector in particular. So Robert, as an individual and a citizen of Seattle, perhaps you could throw out some ideas of the types of programs we might envision or consider in the coming efforts to comply with the Clean Energy Transformation Act.
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk about that, Jack. And forgive me if this feels like a little bit of a dodge, but again, I'm deeply cognizant of our industry bias towards knowing what's best and sort of having that attitude culturally. And so I'm really taking a lot of very deliberate steps with the folks here at the Customer Energy Solutions team that I support to really try to recenter our customers in the what we call the opportunity phase of investigating what the programs are. So, for example, we could talk about grid-connected water heaters as a possible demand response program that we would roll out, and I would not at all be surprised if that were the case. But I'm also pushing quite hard for us to have customer conversations in advance of deciding or defining and designing the kind of programs that we want to offer. So with that slight caveat or placeholder for the idea that we really need to center these communities that we've maybe not served well in the past in these conversations going forward. And so I'll just continue with the water heater example. If I ran a sort of traditional demand response incentive structure, we would do something like, here's a 20% discount if you install this type of water heater, right? But a 20% incentive discount doesn't do customers any good if they can't afford the other 80%, let alone the installation costs. And so to really do the equity work well, we're going to have to fundamentally rethink how we deliver some of these programs. And that may mean that some of these programs are going to have to occur at very, very low or no cost to the participants in those communities. Apropos of my one of the comments I made in my opening statement, my expectation is that we're going to have to work really hard with our commercial and industrial customers to go deeper and really achieve as much efficiency as we can in working with those building owners and working with those businesses, because ultimately the cost per kilowatt hour saved, if you will, for the residential or the equity focused programs that we envision deploying in the coming years is likely to be quite high relative to an incentive structured program.
Excellent.
I would certainly welcome others' thoughts on that.
Well, maybe Alexi, I mean, you've been taking a broad look at utilities across the country, addressing zero carbon and zero energy building and deployment of distributed energy resources. Are you seeing any types of programs that, the Robert Cromwells of the world should consider in terms of deploying renewables and helping modernize the grid while achieving decarbonization and centering on equity?
That's the holy grail, isn't it? There are steps in that direction. One thing that comes to mind, it might be a year ago now, Sacramento Municipal Utility District, SMUD, stopped running efficiency programs. They run carbon reduction programs. They changed the metric entirely from energy efficiency to greenhouse gases. And so it's not about saving energy. We don't really need to save that much energy in this country. We're one of the, last year maybe, we were the largest oil producer in the world. We're right up there, number 1 or 2 every year, the last recent several years. We have plenty of energy. It's all about the cost and the carbon implications of burning that stuff. And so I think it's encouraging to see the metrics start to change from site energy efficiency savings to what I think are more impactful metrics in the long run: customer cost impacts, societal costs, things like carbon, those kind of metrics. So that's an encouraging shift, and that's pretty behind the scenes, but it does trickle down in terms of the impacts. And so bringing in additional metrics, and Robert's suggesting that basically is if we're considering running programs that would not pass the sniff test in the conventional total resource cost, energy efficiency, paradigm, where it's like, how many kilowatt hours did I get and how many dollars did I spend to do it? A program that's got a real equity component and is willing to accept a somewhat higher cost per kilowatt hour, that implies that there's something else we're driving for here. And in this case, it's equity. In some cases, it may be carbon savings. So I'm encouraged to see that shift. I think somewhere like Seattle with really clean electricity, there's an increasing focus to be paid on electrification. And that's both transportation and building electrification, finding the cases where it makes sense to either use incentive dollars or some other approaches to bring down the cost, the first cost, which can be a barrier for electrification, and also ensure that there are no equity implications of ongoing cost or maintenance issues when we're putting that equipment in. So
yeah,
there are a couple pieces.
Sorry, I was going to tee off your comment, Alexi. Great example. The challenge that we've got, though, is when CETA was passed in 2019, it did not supplant other statutory obligations, right? So the conservation and the renewal requirements of I-937 that were passed back in, what was it, 06, I think, 06, 07, those remain. I still have to do a conservation potential assessment. I still have to publish my 4 and 10-year targets. I still have to drive for and achieve those targets, as well as attempt this pivot, as you described, to inculcating carbon and equity as kind of core goals of the work that we do. And that's going to be part of the challenge. You know, Jack, I'm just looking at the chat now too, and there's a few questions there I wanted to address as well. And you know, to Alexi's point, we have published a transportation electrification plan. We have a building electrification plan in flight that I expect we'll be able to talk about soon. But more concretely, our mayor and city council have approved a Renewable Plus program for our large customers. Jeanette, I don't know you, but I see your questions there. I will, without discussing the customers that we're speaking with, I will just say that the ordinance that was passed by the city council on Monday does authorize us to deploy direct renewable purchases on behalf of customers who seek those types of products to achieve their own sustainability goals. So we are putting in place the tools we'll need to be able to offer those kind of products to our customers. In terms of the Bitcoin stuff, you know, I am always leery when I'm asked to make judgments about how my customer uses power. You know, if for folks who may be familiar with the industry, you know, jumping the meter or, you know, power theft, it has been a significant issue in the past. First house I bought in the city of Seattle was down in the Rainier Valley, and I'll just say that some of the equipment in the basement when I bought that house made it clear that they had been engaged in recreational agriculture in that location prior to my occupancy. We probably see a lot less of that now, practically just because of the change in laws. But you know, it's always a very touchy thing when you start having to make judgments about how someone should be using power. Now that's very different in terms than saying that there should be differences in rates based upon usage. And one thing I'll note, you know, one of the interesting slides that you shared there, Alexi, what some of your graphs triggered for me is the interesting correlation between both the diurnal energy pattern and carbon intensity and the seasonal energy intensity. So whether you're looking across the year 8760 or you're looking at just 24 hours in a day, there is a periodicity to this that parallels quite clearly, and it's the evenings, it's the shoulders. Anytime there's an energy peak, you know, that's when the thermal based electricity is being used much more heavily than any of us would prefer. And apologies, my automatic light signal is turning the lights off in my office. So thank you for those questions, Jeanette. Any other questions from the audience?
Feel free to use the chat. We've got a small enough group. If you want to unmute and just ask a question, that's also welcome. Robert, you got your hand up. Do you want to chime in?
Awesome discussion. Yeah, enjoying hearing a lot of the stuff that's going on with the buildings, but definitely been staying tuned to what City Light is up to. My question pertains, you know, there's a comment on Bitcoin, but really cryptocurrencies in general, and if there's been any movement to develop like a utility coin or a carbon coin, something that, you know, millennials and younger can jump on and try to build the momentum and value with, but something that, you know, kind of embodies the ethics behind carbon, low fuels, carbon neutral energy.
Sure, Robert, without going into the geeky weeds, if you want to talk about blockchain technology, which is the foundation for Bitcoin and similar kinds of, I'll just call them tokens of value to be generic. Yes, there are a number of companies out there that are promoting blockchain-based renewable tracking and carbon accounting. I would say that, you know, there certainly isn't anything approaching an industry standard around that, but there are a number of startups, including in the Seattle area, that are promoting that approach.
And sometimes either the barrier or even the trigger is regulatory. So in New York, there's a piece of legislation, the New York Rev, reforming the energy vision. And one thing Rev has done is basically enable transactive energy, like blockchain transactions between non-utility players, right? You and your neighbor. It's laid the regulatory structure to enable things like, my neighbor's got a solar array and I want to buy some of that power. That's the regulatory and financial piece. Obviously, there's a physical infrastructure piece, right? Because Seattle City Light still runs the grid. So there are more pieces to the picture, but in some cases there's a regulatory component that either has to be adjusted or is being adjusted. I don't know the picture in Washington on transactive energy. Maybe someone can fill me in.
You know, I have not followed it very closely, Alexi, but I would say that one of the challenges I've heard come up a few years back in the EV charging space was whether EV charging was in fact a utility function for which a private corporation would need to be regulated by the Utility and Transportation Commission in Olympia. I believe they've gotten past that because I haven't heard about it lately. I don't know what the solution was. Maybe there was a statutory amendment to their the UTC's organic statutes to sort of carve that out. But I would imagine you're likely seeing a similar regulatory construct if you were sort of creating a transactive energy structure that disaggregated or disintermediated from the utility and was sort of more of a customer to customer, peer to peer kind of construct. I think whoever were providing that, it'd be, if you're moving energy, you're probably a utility, and if you're a utility, you're going to have to report to the UTC in Olympia if you're owned by a corporation.
And I kick that conversation a little further, just being based in the Seattle area on Duwamish occupied land. You know, tribes are making a major shift towards energy sovereignty and improving, strengthening resilience and creating more access for workforce development opportunities for tribal members. We're seeing a lot of efforts towards microgrid deployment and potentially autonomous operation in the next, decades. How do you, as a group, see the deployment of microgrids as a component of this clean energy transformation?
Well, I guess as the utility guy, I'll go first and let everybody chime in. I think from a resiliency or a sustainability, I'm sorry, let me say a reliability resiliency perspective, I think they can be incredibly valuable. We recently deployed one at the Miller Community Center here in Seattle. The idea being that in an earthquake scenario, or if you have a winter storm that's taken down the system and we're putting all the wire back up in the air, folks have a place to go where they can charge their cell phones, or a place where they can go and have a warming shelter type of scenario. I think at least in the early days, that's likely to be the highest value in a dense urban area like Seattle. This summer's experience with the hot weather and the smoke got me thinking a lot about frankly, customer survival. We did not have the bad luck that Texas did last winter when their system went down, but they were mere minutes away from the entire state collapsing and losing voltage stability. We in the event that we see the big earthquake, the big one we're all waiting for and hoping never comes, I think those kinds of microgrid applications would be a great way to bake in resiliency and support the public health of the customers that we serve. I think obviously campus environments or areas where you can integrate a district energy system or other tools where you're bringing more than one solution to the package, I think will be helpful. But probably everybody here on this call understands that typical daily consumption exceeds what you can put on site in any combination of PV and batteries under any reasonable circumstance. You either have to overbuild the battery and the solar panel to a scale that's probably uneconomic. If you were trying to, for example, ride through a winter storm event, I'll just say, Jack, you'll appreciate this. At one of my first calls with the regional council, where we were talking about this, being the new guy, I just sort of threw out a question of, is anybody talking about a 100-hour demand response? Because for me, the thing that really worries me is our winter storm events, where we have about a week of really cold weather. And unfortunately, most sort of high volume or high energy demand response programs typically are involving heating or cooling in some fashion. And no one's gonna turn off their thermostat in the middle of a storm. So we need to find other ways. We need to find other tools to try and achieve those goals if we're really going to be successful in decarbonizing those kinds of events that Alexi illustrated in his annual graph.
And I'll note that there's going to be a lot of change and new equipment coming onto the electricity system. If we, in the Pacific Northwest, more energy flows through in the gas system than flows through in the electric system annually. So if we're talking about decarbonizing the whole system, which CETA says we are, among other things, among other policies, I mean, that's a lot. Even given that heat pumps are 3 times-ish more efficient than electric resistance, which is more efficient than burning gas, we're still talking about a bunch more load coming onto the system. So we're going to see more things like microgrids, and given that there will be a lot more equipment, more throughput, and those changes, I think it's really important to keep that co-optimization in mind. So when we're putting in a microgrid, we want to get that resiliency. We also want to make sure that it's incorporating communications equipment, that we can put in something flexible, and then it can play nice and help support that broader transition. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities to figure out all the details on this, but I think the co-optimization is a really important perspective there.
Last question for Eli. Do you think we should be starting with affordable housing when we consider deploying microgrids?
I've been wondering about that a little bit. I'm always a little reluctant to experiment with new technologies in the affordable housing space, just because we have very limited capital to sort of build these buildings in the first place, and any increased cost by just, unfortunately, it's a zero-sum game, is probably going to mean less units. So I'm always a little reluctant to start out with something new in affordable housing. I kind of prefer maybe to have the market bring down the costs a little bit, and then we can sort of bring it over to affordable housing. That's generally how I do sort of feel about those things. But like Robert was saying, I mean, when we think about those heating events that we had over the summer, and we think about low-income senior properties and the potential of losing power, I mean, then you sort of get into a little bit of a different story. But generally, yeah, a little reluctant to especially if we don't know what, and also these buildings operate, the annual operations of them, there's not a lot of excess cash flow. So, if we don't know what the long-term maintenance of these sort of systems are, even if we could be burdening them further down the line too. So it's a hard toss-up, right? Between thinking we're doing something really great, but then in the end we end up very, very burdening, the people who can least manage being able to be burdened by these sort of costs. So good question, Jack. I don't know if I have an answer for you.
And that's a great answer. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you all. I want to thank you all again for taking the time, sharing your thoughts. Your presentations were, I think, really well received. For anyone that has follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. I think you've got Eli's contact, and we can send a recap, including the presentation recording following this presentation. Just want to thank everyone again. Have a wonderful day, and keep up the great work.